Yes, your buckle. Do you want a brother or a sister?
Sister.
You want a little sister?
Yeah.
You want to be a big sister?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay. Go, Cece. Go, Bella. Careful, Cece. You're going to get dizzy. You're going to get dizzy, Cece. You're going to get dizzy. Blow on it, Cece. No, don't let her touch the plate. No, 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 no. Blow on it, Cece. Okay, look. Blow. Cece, blow. Say hi, Cece. Hi. Look at this monster. This is what I deal with. Like, she's a monster. Don't you jump off the couch. Oh. I'm sitting right here, Mama. She's a monster. Like, she doesn't stop. Like, seriously, this kid hasn't napped today. No, don't stay on my legs, baby. My life. You want more cereal?
Yeah, I wipe it.
I'll wipe it.
It's boo-boo.
It's a boo-boo. Cece, are you hungry? Celeste. Hey, are you hungry?
Yeah.
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 Cereal.
I wipe it.
We'll wipe it. So, I feel really blessed this summer. I'm going to...
The morning sky over Frederick, Colorado, was just beginning to pale when the search began. Police officers moved carefully through the quiet neighborhood, knocking on doors, calling out Shanann what's name, their voices echoing through the still air. Inside one of those homes, Chris Watt sat alone on the couch, his arms crossed tightly against his chest. He looked calm, too calm for a man whose wife and two small daughters were missing. Outside, a world was starting to unravel, but inside that living room sat the man who had already destroyed it. There are moments in life when love dies, not with shouting or violence, but with quiet, deliberate decisions. For Chris Watts, that moment had already come long before the police arrived. To understand what led him to that unimaginable act, you have to go back to when everything appeared perfect, before the silence, before the lies, before the spark of darkness turned into something irreversible. Chris was the kind of man no one ever suspected. A quiet neighbor, a father who smiled at his daughter's birthday parties, a husband who posed for family photos with his arm wrapped around his pregnant wife. But behind those small gestures of domestic normalcy, something had shifted. There was a growing emptiness in him, an emotional vacancy that even he couldn't explain. He had begun living two lives, one built on public affection and the other on private betrayal. That morning, as search teams fanned out across Frederick, every clue they uncovered pointed back to one chilling truth: something had broken inside Chris Watts. The moment he stopped loving them was the moment he stopped being human. You're watching Sinister Tales. Before we continue, like, share, and subscribe to help uncover the truth behind America's most haunting crimes. Chris Watts was born in Spring Lake, North Carolina, in 1985. By all outward appearances, he was the quiet type, polite, steady, predictable. He wasn't the life of any party, but he was dependable, a man who seemed to value structure and simplicity. Shanann Catherine Razusek, on the other hand, was radiant and full of drive. Born in New Jersey and raised in North Carolina, she was ambitious and outgoing, a woman who fought her way through hardship. After surviving lupus, she became even more determined to create a happy, stable life. When the two met, their personalities seemed to fit perfectly, her energy balanced by his calm, her optimism grounding his restraint. They married in 2012 and settled in Frederick, Colorado, where they built what looked like a perfect life. Shanann poured her heart into their home, decorating every inch of it with warmth and love. Their daughters, Bella and Celeste, became the center of their universe, and social media reflected that perfection. Shanann shared everything: family dinners, birthdays, vacations, and her excitement about their third child, a baby boy they planned to name Nico. To friends, they were the definition of a dream family. But under the surface, cracks were forming. Financial strain, long work hours, and emotional distance began to take their toll. Chris grew more withdrawn. Shanann, sensing something was wrong, tried harder, sending loving texts, planning trips, doing everything she could to keep their marriage alive. But the more she reached out, the further he drifted. Unknown to her, he had begun an affair with a woman from work, and that secret would soon consume everything. The family everyone admired online was quietly falling apart in real life. You're watching Sinister Tales. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. It helps us keep uncovering the dark truths behind the faces we think we know. By the summer of 2018, the signs were everywhere: small, ordinary moments that, in hindsight, carried the weight of tragedy. Shanann could feel it. The distance, the coldness, the growing silence from the man who once kissed her forehead before work every morning. He no longer looked her in the eyes. His phone, once left carelessly on the counter, was now guarded like a secret. Friends noticed her tone changing in texts and calls. She was anxious, confused, trying to make sense of what felt like emotional abandonment. Chris, meanwhile, was living a double life. At work, he had fallen into an affair with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, someone who made him feel new again, free from the pressures of family and fatherhood. To her, he was a man trapped in an unhappy marriage. To Shanann, he was simply changing, becoming colder, more distant, but still her husband. She had no idea that while she was planning their baby's arrival, he was planning a future without her or their children. As the weeks passed, Shanann tried to bridge the gap. She texted long messages full of hope, telling him she believed they could find their way back. He responded with short phrases and empty words. On their family vacation, she noticed how detached he was with the girls. The man who once played in the pool with them now scrolled through his phone, staring blankly into the distance. Those around them sensed something was wrong. Shanann's friends urged her to protect herself emotionally, but she refused to give up. She believed in her family, in the vows they had made. What she didn't know was that Chris's heart had already crossed a line. He wasn't just distant, he was gone. You're watching Sinister Tales. If you believe in exposing the truth behind these quiet warning signs, like, share, and subscribe to support stories that remind us how darkness often hides behind ordinary smiles. The night of August 13th began like any other for most of Frederick, Colorado, but for the Watts family, it would be their last. After returning home from a business trip, Shanann Watts carried her luggage quietly through the front door at 1:48 a.m. The home security camera caught her final moments alive. Inside, Chris Watts was awake, pacing. To outsiders, it would have been impossible to guess what was about to unfold. But for Chris, the decision had already been made. In his mind, he had rehearsed it. He had crossed a line from fantasy to intention. What happened next would never make sense to anyone who still believes love is sacred. In the silence of their bedroom, an argument turned deadly. Chris pressed his hands around Shanann's neck until the life left her body, their unborn son's heartbeat fading with hers. The quiet that followed was not peace, it was the birth of horror. From the hallway, small voices stirred. Bella, 4 years old, asked what was wrong with Mommy. Celeste, just 3, rubbed her eyes. Chris told them nothing was wrong. But everything was. He wrapped Shanann's body in a sheet and carried her to his truck. The girls followed, still alive, still trusting their father. They sat in the back seat as he drove toward a remote oil field owned by his company, Anadarko Petroleum. As the truck rolled through the pre-dawn darkness, the only sound was the hum of the engine and the quiet breathing of 2 children who believed they were safe. At that moment, Chris Watts wasn't a husband or a father anymore. He was something else, something no one had ever seen in him. A man without empathy. A man who had stopped loving them long before he took their lives. You're watching Sinister Tales. Before we continue, like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these stories alive and remembered. By sunrise, the illusion began. Chris Watts texted co-workers, sent messages to Shanann's phone, and made calls that were never meant to be answered. He pretended concern, crafting a fragile performance to hide the unthinkable truth. When Shanann's friend Nicole Atkinson couldn't reach her that morning, she drove to the Watts home herself. The blinds were shut, the car was still in the garage, and Shanann's shoes sat neatly by the door. Nicole's instincts screamed that something was wrong. Her 911 call would unravel the nightmare Chris had tried to disguise. When officers arrived, Chris opened the door with a forced calmness. He smiled, invited them in, and talked about how his family might have gone to a friend's house. But small details betrayed him, the phone still charging on the couch, the wedding ring left on a nightstand, the children's blankets untouched. Everything inside that house felt staged, too still, too clean. Detectives immediately sensed that the husband's grief was missing something vital, real emotion. Later, surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera confirmed their suspicions. It showed Chris backing his truck into the garage at dawn, loading something large before driving away. When the neighbor replayed the clip, Chris shifted uneasily, crossing his arms tightly. The moment he left, the neighbor turned to the officer and whispered, "Something's off with him." As the investigation intensified, Chris sat for interviews, speaking softly, carefully, choosing every word. But when he failed a polygraph test, the facade cracked. Confronted with the evidence, he broke down, not in sorrow, but in defeat, and confessed to everything. What began as a missing person case had transformed into one of the most haunting family murders in American history. You're watching True Crime Log. If you believe in truth over lies, like, share, and subscribe to help us keep stories like this from fading into silence. The courtroom in Greeley, Colorado, was packed to capacity. The air felt thick, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. Reporters filled the back rows, while Shanann's family sat motionless, their eyes red from weeks of unbearable grief. On November 19, 2018, Chris Watts entered the courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit, his wrists bound, his face pale and emotionless. The same man who once smiled in family photos now stood as the embodiment of betrayal. Every seat was taken as the judge read through the list of crimes: the murder of Shanann Watts, the murder of Bella, the murder of Celeste, the unlawful termination of Shanann's pregnancy, and tampering with human remains. Each charge carried a weight that seemed to echo through the room. Chris had already accepted a plea deal to avoid the death penalty, a decision Shanann's family supported to spare themselves the agony of a prolonged trial. But even with that, the details of what he did were almost impossible to hear. The prosecutor described how he strangled Shanann, smothered his daughters, and hid their bodies in an oil field. Each fact landed like a hammer. Family members sobbed quietly as the prosecutor played his final words for the record: he systematically and methodically annihilated his entire family. When the judge finally spoke, his words were cold and final. Chris Watts was sentenced to 5 life terms without the possibility of parole, plus 84 additional years for the other charges. As the sentence was handed down, Shanann's mother whispered a prayer under her breath. Chris stared forward, unmoved. There was no apology that could reach what he'd done. Justice had been served, but peace was something the Rzusek family would never fully find. You're watching Sinister Tales. If you believe justice should always have a voice, like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring these true stories to light. In the days that followed the sentencing, Frederick, Colorado, was never the same. The quiet suburban streets that once echoed with the laughter of 2 little girls now carried only the hum of passing cars and the occasional news van. Neighbors who had once shared cookouts and Christmas cards stood at their windows, still unable to believe what had happened inside that ordinary home. The Watts house became an unspoken wound, a reminder that monsters don't always come from the dark, sometimes they live next door. For Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Rzusek, the aftermath was a living nightmare. They had loved Chris like a son, trusted him with their daughter's life, and adored the grandchildren he had taken from them. Every photograph, every toy, every memory now carried a sting that never faded. When they spoke publicly for the first time, their words were quiet but powerful. They said they forgave him, not for his sake, but so that they could begin to heal. But forgiveness did not erase the grief. It only allowed them to survive it. Across the country, people who had followed the case online mourned Shanann as if they knew her personally. They replayed her videos, the birthday parties, the pregnancy announcement, the bright smile that hid so much pain, and wondered how love could turn into something so cruel. Candlelight vigils filled the evenings, where strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, holding photos of Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico, promising that their story would never be forgotten. You're watching Sinister Tales. If this story has moved you, like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us honor victims and bring awareness to the signs of domestic danger before it's too late. Years later, the house on Saratoga Trail still stands, an empty shell with curtains drawn and a silence that feels almost alive. The walls that once held laughter and bedtime songs now hold ghosts, not of the supernatural, but of memory. Each window seems to stare back at the world that watched the Watts family unravel. Time has passed, but the story has never faded. People still drive by, slowing their cars to look at the home where love died in the quietest, cruelest way imaginable. Inside prison walls, Chris Watts lives a life stripped of meaning. He spends his days in isolation, reading the Bible, writing letters to people who still reach out to him, some seeking answers, others seeking redemption through him. Reports describe a man haunted not by guilt, but by what he lost control of. He tells cellmates about dreams of his daughters, about seeing their faces in his sleep. But for many, there's no redemption to be found, only the image of a man who stopped loving his family long before he took their lives. For Shanann's family, every day is survival. They speak her name, share her story, and keep her memory alive through advocacy for victims of domestic violence. Shanann's last months are now studied as a heartbreaking example of emotional manipulation, a warning that control and detachment can sometimes be the calm before destruction. The tragedy of the Watts family forces us to confront something deeply human: how can love turn so dark? Was it greed, lust, cowardice, or something colder, something empty that no one saw coming? This is Sinister Tales. If this story made you think, like, share, and subscribe, and turn on notifications to never miss our next case. And now, a question for you. At what moment do you think Chris Watts truly stopped loving them?